Bernard King. I talked about George Gervin being the best pure scorer I've probably ever seen. Bernard King is in that same category.
To me, Bernard King was the most exciting, explosive weapon in the history of the Knicks.
He tends to be rightfully acknowledged for how good he was as a New York Knick. But the problem is that it seems like whenever you hear about Bernard King, that's all you hear about. His back-to-back 50-point games, his dominant 84 playoff run, his 60-point Christmas Day, and finally his gruesome knee injury. But all of that happened in less than a 2-year period when he was a Knick. Yet before he even got to New York, he had already been one of the league's best scorers for half a decade. And after what many believed to be a career-ending knee injury, he came back and once again became one of the league's elite scorers during an underrated stint in Washington. And you also can't forget about his incredible college career at Tennessee. But in mentioning his greatness, you also need to acknowledge his mistakes, as Bernard King had significant substance abuse problems, which led to him making some horrible decisions during the early years of his career, which may be why you don't hear about those years as much. But he did his best to improve himself during the remainder of his time in the league. But as far as his playing career goes, it seems that Bernard King is more remembered for moments than he is an entire career of high-level play. And for as good as he was with New York, the career of the BK Broiler is so much more than his 3 years with the Knicks. Let's jog your memory. Bernard King turned out to be the most successful basketball player in his family, yet there was a time when his younger brother Albert was expected to be even better than him. Yet King would have more success due to his commitment to the game. King was a Brooklyn native and would attend Fort Hamilton High School, where he would quickly become one of New York's top players, even earning all-city honors as a senior. So he would have some control over where he wanted to go for college, and he ended up choosing Tennessee. A Brooklyn native going to Knoxville, Tennessee was a bit of a surprise, and he would also be joining another New York recruit in Ernie Grunfeld. Tennessee executive coach Stu Aberdeen had spent nearly 2 months in New York recruiting a young Grunfeld, and during that time, he would be able to persuade King to at least give a visit to Knoxville. And when he did, the town had a Bernard King day. King was impressed, but what was more appealing was that Tennessee promised the soon-to-be freshman not only an opportunity to start, but a system which would allow him and the soon-to-be sophomore Grunfeld to be the team's 2 stars and the ones responsible for most of the scoring. And that was enough for King, as he would join Grunfeld at Tennessee, and the Vols would be debuting the Ernie and Bernie show come 1975. And before I keep going, I just gotta correct myself for saying in my Allen Houston video that he was the best Vol in program history. I don't know how King slipped my mind, but the best Vol is King, and it's not really close. But back to the video. King and Grunfeld became the team's offensive focal points in a run-and-gun system. King was a skinny 6'7" forward, often matched up with guys bigger than him, but King was quick off the dribble, and his shot release was more impressive, as it was so quick that if you blinked, you could miss it. But he wouldn't miss it, as he led the conference in true shooting percentage and points as a freshman, with Grunfeld finishing 3rd. And even with his slender frame, he was also an elite rebounder, finishing 2nd in the conference in that category. In his very first game, he would score 42 points in a win versus Milwaukee, and he was so good as a freshman that people were looking for any reason for him to be ineligible, as letters would be sent to the school suggesting a review of King's high school transcripts, which would eventually lead to King being suspended briefly in early February while the school reviewed his transcripts. Yet by season's end, he would still be first-team All-Conference and the SEC Player of the Year. The bulk of Tennessee's scoring came from Bernie and Ernie, while sophomore Mike Jackson also provided a good third option. Yet although the team started 7-1, they would only go 11-7 the rest of the way, as they finished at 18-8 and would not earn a tournament berth. And King's freshman season would see him average about 26.5 points, 12.5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. King would have a minor knee surgery during the offseason, but would still go on to play 25 of the team's 27 games in 1976. Once again, he would lead the conference in true shooting, and this year his 13 rebounds per game would also lead the conference. His scoring had dropped slightly to 25.2 points per game, which would see him finish 2nd in the conference, with the leading scorer being Grunfeld. So without a doubt, the Vols had the best 1-2 punch in the nation, as the duo even found themselves on the cover of Sports Illustrated. King would once again be named first-team All-Conference and the Conference Player of the Year, while also being named a consensus second-team All-American. And the Vols were having a much better year, as they put together 6-game and 8-game win streaks to get off to a 16-2 start. And although they ended at 21-5, it was still enough for an NCAA tournament berth, where they would take on Virginia Military Institute in the first round. But King wouldn't have his first tournament appearance, as a thumb injury kept him out of the game and Tennessee lost by 6, ending their year. But King's sophomore season saw him average about 25 points, 13 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. And King's upcoming junior season would see him in the news, but for all the wrong reasons. On October 24th, 1976, King was arrested for drunk driving and would be suspended from the team for the rest of the fall quarter. He would play 26 of 28 games this year, but continued to dominate. He dropped to 4th in the conference in true shooting percentage, yet was still over 60%, while again leading the conference in rebounding on a career-high 14.3 per game, and also leapfrogging Grunfeld for the conference lead in scoring at nearly 26 points per game. For the 3rd straight year, he would be first-team All-Conference and Conference Player of the Year, while this year being named a consensus first-team All-American. After a 2-2 start, the Vols would go on a 12-game win streak, which included a win over number 3 Alabama and a win over number 2 Kentucky at Rupp Arena, as overall the Vols would go 22-5 and finish tied with Kentucky for first in the conference at 16-2. They would enter the tournament with a first-round matchup versus Syracuse, and this time they would have King available, but it would be the same result as last year, as Syracuse took the win in OT and ended the Vols' year. King would start slow and was Syracuse's main focus on defense, and even though he came alive in the second half, it wouldn't be enough. He would have 23 points and 12 rebounds, but would shoot about 42% from the field, commit 9 turnovers, and be one of 3 Vols starters to foul out. But for his regular season, he averaged about 26 points, 14.5 rebounds, and 3 assists per game. The Ernie and Bernie show was over for now, as both players declared for the NBA draft. King was granted early eligibility due to being considered a hardship case, and he was also believed by many to be the best talent in the draft, yet he wouldn't be taken till the 7th pick by the New York Nets, who were about to move to New Jersey. But then about a month after the draft, King found himself in trouble again, as he was arrested for breaking into Tennessee's campus and stealing a TV set, which was found in his car. It wasn't quite his hometown team, but playing for New Jersey was pretty close. The Nets had just completed their inaugural season as a member of the NBA, but had gone 22-60, and didn't really have any bright spots on their roster. So a 21-year-old King would be given a lot of responsibility as a rookie, but he would make it look just as easy as he did in college. He would play 79 games as one of the league's top rookies, as he would finish tied for first among rookies in scoring, as well as second in rebounding, and his 24.2 points per game would also tie for the 9th highest average in the NBA. King would hit double figures in 75 games, including 22 games with at least 30 and 2 with at least 40, along with 37 double-doubles, as he was named to the All-Rookie team. The Nets made a mid-season trade with Indiana for John Williamson, who would finish the year as the Nets' top scorer, yet King would be the team's best scorer among players that played at least half the season with the team. Prior to the Williamson trade, the Nets had been terrible, as they were 9-38 at the time of the January 27th trade, and in the middle of a 16-game losing streak. They would have a more respectable end to their season, as they would go 15-20 the rest of the way, but would still finish at 24-58. And King's rookie season would see him average about 24 points, 9.5 rebounds, and 1.5 steals per game. The 1979 Nets would get a full season out of their wing duo of King and Williamson. Both of their scoring averages would drop, yet they would still combine for nearly 44 points per game. King would play all 82 games, and although his scoring and rebounding had dropped, he went from shooting below 48% as a rookie to shooting above 52% in year 2. He would have 75 games in double figures, 15 games with at least 30, and 3 with at least 40, along with 30 double-doubles and a 32-point, 13-rebound, and 11-assist triple-double in a January 12th loss to LA. However, it became clear that King had legitimate struggles with substance abuse, as he would be arrested for drunk driving and cocaine possession on December 19th. The Nets would have an improved year, as they would finish at 37-45, and would get a first-round playoff matchup versus Dr. J and Philly. King would play great, averaging 26 points on 50% shooting, including a game-high 27 in Game 2, but the Sixers would win both games in a 2-game sweep, and King's regular season saw him average about 21.5 points, 8 rebounds, and 3.5 assists per game. But the Nets would decide to make a change in the offseason. The Nets had not been a good rebounding team during King's time there, so to address that, they would pick up big man Cliff Robinson and a more rugged Calvin Nat in the draft, and the offensive-minded King became expendable. So on October 3rd, he was traded to Utah. Along with King, the Jazz had recently acquired Adrian Dantley from the Lakers and looked to have a potential scoring duo for years to come. Additionally, to start the year, they still featured franchise legend Pete Maravich. But one of these offseason moves wouldn't work out for Utah, and it wasn't the Dantley trade. King would appear in 19 games for the Jazz to begin the 1980 season, as he would begin the year as a starter, but after performing poorly, he would find himself on the bench. But then on January 3rd, King was arrested for some serious offenses that he allegedly committed on New Year's. The Jazz would suspend him indefinitely after the charge was made, as King's season ended after 19 games, with him averaging about 9.5 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. But a poor season was the least of King's concerns. Although it was not an excuse, lie detector tests would suggest that King had no recollection of the night in question, and during his suspension, he had been undergoing treatment for alcoholism. Then in the summer, with King facing felony charges for his actions, he would come to a plea agreement, which would see him plead guilty to misdemeanors and avoid jail time, with the judge telling him she would suspend his jail terms to allow him to continue playing basketball and undergoing treatment for his alcoholism. But Jazz GM Frank Layden wouldn't show the same leniency, as he would maintain that King would continue to be suspended from the team, and then just a few months later, King was no longer a member of the Utah Jazz. The Jazz would send King to the Golden State Warriors for Wayne Cooper and a second-round pick. Although King had severely tarnished his reputation, he was still one of the league's best talents, and would reassume his role as a top scorer during the 1981 season. On paper, the 81 Warriors were absolutely stacked. On top of King, they featured a high-scoring guard named World B. Free, a sweet-shooting third-year forward in Purvis Short, and two great rookies in the rugged Larry Smith and the first overall pick out of Purdue in Joe Barry Carroll. King would finish as the team's second leading scorer, as he was back to averaging over 20 a game. His rebounding had dropped, but what was most impressive was that King was shooting a career-high 58.8% from the field, which would be a top 5 mark in the league. King would hit double figures in 76 games, while having 19 games with at least 30, and recording his first career 50-point game against Philly on January 3rd, when he had 50 points on 20 of 25 shooting in a loss. And King's year would see him become the first winner of the NBA's short-lived Comeback Player of the Year award. Offense would not be Golden State's problem, as they would be a top 10 scoring offense in the league, yet they would only go 39-43, and this was thanks to them featuring a bottom 3 scoring defense, as they would miss the playoffs. And for the regular season, King averaged about 22 points, 7 rebounds, and 3.5 assists per game. The Warriors rolled out the same core during the 82 season, but this time King would score over 23 points per game, which would be top 10 in the league, and he would again do so on incredibly efficient shooting, which also saw him finish in the top 10. And King's improved scoring season would see him as the Warriors' top scorer this year. He would hit double figures in 77 games, have 16 games with at least 30, and 2 with at least 40, as he was voted to his first career All-Star team this season, while also being named second team All-NBA. But the Warriors continued to have the same problem, as although their defense had improved, it was still their weak point, as they almost had too many weapons on offense. They would have a better season, finishing at 45-37, but in a competitive Western Conference, this wouldn't be enough for a playoff appearance. And King's season ended with him averaging about 23 points, 6 rebounds, and 3.5 assists per game. And although he had been having success in Golden State, the next stop for King would be a trip home. Shortly before the 83 season, King would be traded to New York for Michael Ray Richardson. Richardson was a much better defensive player, which the Warriors needed. However, King was technically a free agent, and the Knicks offered him a 5-year deal worth $750,000 per year. Yet in 1982, free agency didn't really exist, so Golden State had the right of first refusal, and would say they weren't just going to let King get away. So negotiations ensued, and the Warriors must have liked Richardson enough to part with King. And while still retaining Purvis Short, although it was a big loss, it made sense for Golden State. The offseason was looked at as the renaissance of the New York Knicks. They had been on a downfall since their championship glory of the early 70s, but had just acquired their new franchise player, as well as brought in former player Dave DeBusschere to run the front office, and hired Hubie Brown to replace retired coach Red Holzman. And the cherry on top for King was that a month and a half earlier, they had signed his old friend, bringing back the Ernie and Bernie show. Okay, so it wouldn't exactly be the same, as Grunfeld was nothing more than a rotation player at this point, but it was still a good story. The Knicks featured some solid veterans in Rory Sparrow and Truck Robinson, but their second best player alongside King was 4th-year center Bill Cartwright, who would combine with King to average over 37 points per game. King would ease into Hubie Brown's system, averaging less than 22 points per game, yet continued his incredible efficient shooting at nearly 53%. He would hit double figures in 64 of the 68 games he played, while recording at least 40 points twice, which coincidentally both occurred during away games versus Detroit. But it looked like the same old Knicks to begin the season, as they started 0-7. But over time, they were able to recover, even stringing together an 8-game win streak in March, and by the end of the regular season, they were 44-38, and set to take on the Nets in the first round. This was a very exciting series for King and the King family in general, as Bernard King would be taking on his former team in the Turnpike Classic, and at this point, the Nets featured his brother Albert, who had just ended his second NBA season and had been New Jersey's top scorer. Albert would play well, putting up 21 a game on about 47% shooting, but Big Brother would play better, as he averaged 29 points on over 63% shooting in a 2-game New York sweep, as Bernard King would score a game-high 40 in Game 1, while Albert would have a game-high 25 in Game 2. New York would move on to face Philly, but the Sixers' new acquisition of Moses Malone just made them too strong, as the Knicks were swept in 4. King was efficient, shooting over 54% for the series, but he just wasn't shooting often, as he averaged just 16 points across the first 3 games. He would have a game-high 35 in Game 4, but it was too little too late, as New York's season was over, and for the regular season, King averaged about 22 points, 5 rebounds, and 3 assists per game. Now going into the 1984 season, fans were about to be treated to the brief peak of Bernard King. The Knicks roster looked mostly the same, and King and Cartwright were again the team's top scorers. However, now they were combining for over 43 points per game, as King had elevated his scoring to a then career high 26.3 points per game, which would see him finish top 5 in the league. And although he was shooting more, he hadn't sacrificed efficiency, as he was shooting over 57% from the field, which would be 10th in the league. And although the 3-point line existed, King operated inside that line, but where he would get a lot more of his points would be at the charity stripe, as he was one of the best at drawing fouls, finishing 7th in the league with a career-high 437 made free throws. Halfway through the season, King's scoring had been a bit more modest, as with the Knicks sitting at 24-18 going into the All-Star break, he was only averaging about 23.7 points per game. But he would be playing in the All-Star game for the second time in his career, but it was what he did right after the break that added to the legend of Bernard King. In New York's first game after the break, King went off in San Antonio on January 31st, scoring 50 points on 20 of 30 shooting with 0 threes, to go along with 8 rebounds in a 4-point defeat of the Spurs. The next night, they continued their Texas road trip, as they would face off with the Mavericks. And after playing 44 minutes and scoring 50 points the night before, it was understandable that King may be sluggish this night. But he would come out strong with 11 in the first quarter, then another 11 in the second. He would be even better in the second half, with 14 in the third quarter, and then needing 14 points for another 50-point game, he would score exactly that in the fourth quarter, becoming the first player with back-to-back 50-point games since Rick Barry in 1967, as he would finish the game with 50 points on 20 of 28 shooting and no threes in another win, as New York would win 9 of their first 10 after the All-Star break, and King would have 5 more games with at least 40 over the rest of the year, as he averaged over 30 points in the final 35 games, and the Knicks finished the year at 47-35, as they earned another playoff berth, and King was voted first team All-NBA, while finishing second to Larry Bird in MVP voting. But King wasn't done yet, as he was about to go on a legendary playoff tear. The Knicks were underdogs going against the Pistons in round 1, but King was the definition of unstoppable throughout the series. He would start game 1 by scoring 36 points on over 57% shooting, as the Knicks came back from being down 12 in the fourth to steal a game in Detroit. In game 2, he would have a postseason career high of 46 points on over 51% shooting, yet would do so in a losing effort. Back at the Garden for game 3, King would have another 46-point game, this time shooting over 70% from the field and pulling down 10 rebounds, as the Knicks would go up 2-1. But the Pistons would even the series in Game 4, even though King had 41 points on 60% shooting. So it was do or die going into Game 5. And I'll let Hubie Brown tell you what kind of shape King was in.
We had an added problem because Bernard King had the flu. He did not work out in the shoot-around. The flu was sapping his body. He had a splint on the middle finger of the one hand and a splint on the middle finger of the other hand, playing with 2 dislocations.
But like I said earlier, nothing was going to stop King, as he had 44 points and 12 rebounds on over 65% shooting, as the Knicks outlasted the Pistons in overtime to advance to a second-round matchup versus Boston. This series would not be looking good, as Boston would open with 2 blowout wins, with King averaging just 19.5 points on about 46% shooting over the 2 games. He would have 24 in Game 3 as the Knicks were able to get a win at home, and he would then erupt for 41 points on 68% shooting in a Game 4 win, as the Knicks evened the series. A Game 5 blowout loss would see him drop 30 on nearly 53% shooting, and then needing a win, he would go for 44 on 64% shooting to force a Game 7. Game 7 would see King have a team-high 24 on 47% shooting, but a 39-point triple-double from Larry Bird would lead the Celtics to victory. Yet even though the Knicks' postseason was over, Bernard King had made his mark, and for the regular season, he would average about 26.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. Days before the 1985 regular season, the Knicks were dealt a huge blow, as Cartwright suffered a foot injury, which would ultimately keep him out all season. So King would now have to take on an even bigger offensive load, but that was no problem for him. He started the year scoring at an incredible rate, hitting at least 30 points more often than he was scoring below 20, and would put together a 3-game stretch in late November where he had 40 points, 45 points, and then 52 points, shooting over 60% in all 3 games. And his peak performance came about a month later during a Christmas Day game versus the New Jersey Nets. King would dominate in the first 24 minutes, as by halftime he had already scored 40 points. He had cooled down in the second half to the tune of 20 points, but when it was all said and done, King finished with 60 points on 19 of 30 from the field and 22 of 26 from the free throw line, as his 60-point performance was a career high and stood as the all-time Knicks record until Carmelo Anthony's 62-point game in 2014. But even so, the Knicks lost, and that was how their season was going. King was the team's whole offense, and even with his incredible performances, he couldn't do it all, as after the loss, they were 12-19 and would continue losing, as they entered the All-Star break at 18-33, with King participating in his 3rd career All-Star game. The losing continued, and the Knicks were 24-46 going into a March 23rd game versus Kansas City. King was doing his thing, as he had 37 points on 16 of 26 from the field, but once again it looked like the Knicks were on their way to another loss late in the game. But then what should have been just a routine play turned into a career-altering moment for King. As he hustled back to contest a breakaway dunk by Reggie Theus, King injured his knee, and it looked serious. King would be carried off the court, and a few days later, it would be confirmed that King had suffered a torn ACL as well as torn cartilage in his right knee, which in 1984 was essentially a career death sentence. The injury would obviously end King's season, as the Knicks would lose the final 11 games of the year to finish at 24-58 and miss the playoffs. And in King's 55 games, he would average a career high and league-leading 32.9 points, 6 rebounds, and 3.5 assists per game. The injury was severe, and the rehab would be extensive, but King was determined to make a return to the NBA and prove all the doubters wrong. The 85 NBA draft had occurred over the offseason, where the Knicks infamously were awarded the 1st overall pick, and were able to select Georgetown's Patrick Ewing, who would star for the team as a rookie, but would also struggle with injury. But he continued to look like the future during the 1987 season, and up to this point, King had completely secluded himself during his rehab, as the second-year Knicks center hadn't even met him. But then around Christmas time, an announcement was made that King would be holding a press conference.
Today, I can say I will resume my career with the New York Knicks, and I intend to play for many years to come.
King confirmed his intention to come back, and then a few months later, on April 10th, he would make his long-awaited return to an ecstatic crowd at the Garden. The King return gave Knicks fans something to cheer for, as they had lost Ewing to season-ending injury in March, and were 24-53 going into King's comeback game. He would have 7 points in his comeback, but would score a lot like the King of old over the next 6 games he played before the season ended, as in his brief return, he would average about 22.5 points, 5.5 rebounds, and 3 assists per game. But King's contract was up, and the Knicks would renounce his rights. Teams were willing to take a chance on the star with the reconstructed knee, as the Washington Bullets signed him to a multi-year contract. The Bullets featured a solid duo already in veteran center Moses Malone and a high-scoring guard on the wing in Jeff Malone. The Bullets would waste no time in getting King back to significant minutes, as by his second game of the year, he played 44 minutes and scored 25 points. King would go back and forth between the starting lineup and the bench this year, as he appeared in 69 games and started 38 of them. playing nearly 30 minutes per game. The Bullets had been a fringe playoff team for the past few years, and that remained the same this year. King would form a solid trio with the two Malones, as he would finish third on the team in scoring, with the three combining for 58 points per game. And King would still record 53 games in double figures, and 5 games with at least 30, on over 50% shooting. And although King no longer had the explosion to blow past defenders, he was still great in the mid-range, and would spend a lot more time going to work in the post, where he seemed to be automatic. The Bullets would start the season 8-19 before head coach Kevin Loggery was replaced with Wes Unseld, and they would go 30-25 the rest of the way to finish at 38-44, which would be enough for a first-round matchup versus heavily favored Detroit. The Pistons would win the first 2 games as expected, as King was only averaging 6.5 points after 2 games. But then he would score 19 in games 3 and 4, as the Bullets shocked the Pistons to force a deciding game 5. King would have 18 points in game 5, but Detroit would win easily to end the Bullets season, as King averaged about 17 points, 4 rebounds, and 3 assists per game. Moses Malone was gone going into the 1989 season, but King now had a full season under his belt post-injury, and Unseld wouldn't keep any restrictions on him, as he would play and start in 81 games, getting about 31.5 minutes per game. He had upped his scoring by over 3 points per game to finish second on the team behind Jeff Malone, as the two combined for over 42 per game. King would hit double figures in 74 games and have 15 games with at least 30, while recording a 43-point game in an April 4th win versus New Jersey. But although Washington finished with a better record at 40-42, it wouldn't be enough for a playoff berth, as King ended the year averaging about 20.5 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 3.5 assists per game. 1990 saw further decline in Washington. The team got a good year out of guard Darrell Walker, as he finished top 10 in the NBA in assists. But after a great start to the year from forward John Hotplate Williams, he would be lost for the year in early December. King continued to improve his scoring, again finishing second on the team, as him and Malone combined for over 46 points per game. King would also play and start in all 82 games for the second and final time of his career, as he would hit double figures in all but 3 games, while having 18 games with at least 30, and recording 8 double-doubles. And he would also become a more willing passer this year, as he averaged a career-high 4.6 assists per game. But now the Bullets possessed a bottom 5 scoring offense in the league, as they would go just 31-51 and again miss the playoffs. But King would average about 22.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 4.5 assists per game. The Bullets weren't going to be a threat anytime soon, but the 91 season would be the year that King would finally feel like he accomplished what he set out to do after the injury. An off-season trade would see Jeff Malone sent to Utah, with Washington receiving Purvis Ellison in return. And after 2 years in a minimal role, third-year Harvey Grant would have a breakout season for the Bullets, finishing as the team's second leading scorer. But he was over 10 points behind their leading scorer, in King. King would have the second best scoring season of his career at 34 years old. He seemed to be on a mission this year, as in just the second game of the season, he dropped 44 points in a win over the Michael Jordan-led Chicago Bulls, then would have 45 against the Kings a few weeks later. He would drop 46 against Cleveland on December 22nd, then a week later would have 52 points on over 57% shooting in a defeat of Denver, and would follow that up with 46 points versus Charlotte a few nights later. And finally, in a January 31st game against New York at the Garden, he would have 49 points and 11 rebounds on 20 of 35 from the field in a 9-point Bullets win. Ultimately, King would finish the year with 29 games with at least 30, 11 games with at least 40, and 2 games with at least 50. And his incredible season saw him voted to his 4th and final All-Star game and be voted 3rd team All-NBA, as he became emotional after making his return to the All-Star game. And although he missed a lot of the second half of the year with a back injury, by season's end, he was once again one of the most lethal scorers in the NBA, as his 28.4 points per game would see him finish 3rd in the league. But similar to his time in New York, he couldn't do it all, as Washington overall had a bottom 5 scoring defense and would finish the year at 30-52 and miss the playoffs, as King's season saw him average about 28.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 4.5 assists per game. During the offseason, King had another surgery on his right knee to remove torn cartilage, and would miss all of training camp and the beginning of the season. But then by December, his knee still wasn't making any progress, and with no set timetable on the healing process, he would miss the entire 92 season. And then going into the 93 season, he was still injured, and what was once a fruitful partnership with Washington would sour immediately. King would practice with the team for the first time in about 16 months on January 7th, and almost instantly would ask to be activated. which coach Wes Unseld wasn't in full agreement with, leading to him and King arguing. And on top of King having some choice words for Unseld, the two also became physical. And then days later, King essentially demanded a trade and would then be suspended. So on January 22nd, the Bullets would release the 4-time All-Star, and a couple weeks later, he would return to where it all started and sign on for the remainder of the year with New Jersey. He would appear in 32 games in a bench role, as his best games would come in an April 2nd loss to Chicago, in which he had 21 points, and an April 23rd loss to Orlando, in which he had 24 points. But the Nets finished 43-39 and got a first-round matchup versus Cleveland, which they would lose in 5. King would start game 1 and score 8 points in a loss, but then would only see a few minutes of action in games 3 and 4. And for his regular season, King averaged about 7 points, 2.5 rebounds, and half an assist per game, and he would retire during the offseason. Bernard King is far from perfect, and would continue to have his struggles with alcohol and the law after his retirement. It seems he's on a better path today, but he went through his fair share of ups and downs throughout his career. From a basketball standpoint, Bernard King had one of the most complete offensive games of all time. His early years playing down low helped him develop a great post-game and finishing ability, but he also had an explosive first step pre-knee injury and a lightning-quick shooting release that never left him. He was the best Tennessee Volunteer of all time, yet also began struggling with substance abuse during this period. He was great for the Nets and the Warriors in his early years, but again made some terrible decisions that destroyed his reputation and almost his career. He did his best to redeem himself both on and off the court as his career went on, and he would put together an impressive 3-year stretch in New York. He's remembered more for the career that the injury stole, and not as much for the comeback he made, which is unfortunate, as he showed 4 years of constant improvement in Washington until he was again among the league's best. And even though his overall career saw limited team success, it was not his fault, as for a brief period during the mid-80s, Bernard King looked like he was on his way to being the best player in the NBA. But that's it for today's episode on Bernard King. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on his very brief teammate in Utah, or this one on one of his late career New Jersey teammates. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.